Luminary presents Therapy versus the World. I'm your host, Joe Nucci, and I'm very, very excited to share a conversation I had with Greg Lukianoff. Greg Lukianoff is an attorney, a New York Times best-selling author, and the president and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, also known as FIRE. He is the author of several books. The one we're going to focus on today is The Canceling of the American Mind, which he co-authored with Ricky Schlott, where they talk about how cancel culture is not just bad for societies, but also bad for your mental health. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Greg and his work, the FIRE organization used to focus on First Amendment issues in higher ed. They have since expanded to outside of higher ed, and they are truly bipartisan. They are truly apolitical. The only political stance they hold near and dear to themselves is that expressing your thoughts and beliefs is a fundamental human right that needs to be defended. They defend everyone from conservatives to progressives, from people who identify as Zionists to people who identify as very much pro-Palestine, and everyone in between. I really, really enjoyed this conversation with Greg because I was able to test out some of my own ideas about how these topics intersect, and he gave me a lot to think about. I wanted to talk to him for another hour, so I know that you're going to enjoy the episode. Before we get started, please consider liking or subscribing on whatever platform you're watching this on. We would really, really appreciate it. Greg, welcome to the show. I'm very excited for you to be here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's dive right into it. The broader question we're exploring today is free speech good or bad for mental health, both individually and culturally? And I wanted to begin by asking you a little bit about your own mental health journey, because I know that's really informed a lot of the advocacy work that you do and has framed a lot of your thinking over the years. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Sure. I had issues with anxiety and depression since I was, fairly young. And for some reasons I'm not going to get into. But it was getting worse, I would say, in the years prior to 2007. Particularly when I became president of FIRE. I actually took over to back up a little bit. I became legal director of FIRE back when the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, back in 2001. And FIRE had only been around since 1999, so it was a pretty new organization. And it could be an exhausting job because you're constantly in the middle of the culture wars, and people will hate your guts who you don't even know. But I'd gotten used to it. But then I became president of FIRE, and I took over as interim president in 2005, and then I became no longer interim in March 2006. And it was a pretty exhausting job. And whereas I've emphasized the fact that I was in Philadelphia, where I just naturally always feel extremely lonely, but also don't really have friends and family, was a big part of why I got so depressed there. And I talk about that in my book, Coddling the American Mind. I didn't stress as much, and I've been stressing more now, how much the culture war played into it, and how much literally going to bars sometimes and having, conservative want to get in a fist fight with me. This actually happened twice because of cases we defended. And having, a girlfriend in 2007, kind of hate what I did for a living because, I'd be willing to defend conservatives. And I remember I talk about this in Unlearning Liberty. I remember trying to explain to her, listen, I'm an old school ACLU guy. I would defend the free speech rights of the Nazis. I'm certainly going to defend the free speech rights of Republicans. And she literally said, I think Nazis might be worse. And I was like, great, this is fun. And it was just a really lousy year. And I got worse and worse as the year went on. Broke up with a girlfriend, kind of obviously, and I got suicidally depressed in 2007, and I had to be hospitalized in West Philadelphia as a danger to myself. And as I was recovering, and I got to move back up to New York City, Brooklyn, and I got to be more around people that I knew and loved. and I started recovering. But as I was recovering, I was doing cognitive behavioral therapy. And for those of you, who don't know about it, basically the practice of cognitive behavioral therapy is that you look at your exaggerated thoughts, your automatic thoughts when something bad happens to you. Like, let's say, and I always give the example of you go on a date, it doesn't go well, and you come home and say to yourself that, I'm going to die alone. And what you do in CBT, and it only works if you do this as a habit, not just knowing it intellectually. It'll do you no good to just know it intellectually. You have to get in the mental habit of doing this, is you look at what your initial exaggerated thought was, and you scrutinize it. And you ask yourself, is this a cognitive distortion? And what a cognitive distortion is kind of a mental exaggeration. These include things like catastrophizing, check on this one, mind reading, which means that you know exactly what someone else is thinking, check. Fortune telling, that you know how the world things are going to work out, check. Emotional reasoning, because I felt something, it must be true or important. These are all cognitive distortions. And in anxious and depressed people, it's reliably found that these distortions are extra loud and extra persistent. So if you can learn how to get in the habit of talking back to those distortions, you can help treat your anxiety and depression. And for me, it was utterly transformative. A lot of these voices in my head, not in the psychosis way, but like the regular kind of self-criticism, which once used to sound so cruel but also convincing, after getting in the habit of doing CBT, they no longer sounded true to me. And that was an amazing experience, maybe 9 months into treatment, being like, oh, wow, like these voices that I always thought were just like absolutely 100% true just don't sound persuasive anymore.
Yeah, it's a lovely way to describe it. Something that a metaphor I kind of use with my patients is this idea of psychological gymnastics with yourself. You have to kind of start developing these certain moves. One of my favorite definitions of mental health or mental wellness is understanding how your nervous system works and then just taking care of yourself. And that includes your thought patterns and whatever your thought patterns might have a tendency to go towards. So maybe one person under stress tends to exaggerate, catastrophize, things feel a lot bigger than they actually are. Well, if you know that about yourself and you've practiced the CBT techniques, those mental gymnastics techniques to kind of course correct, it can be incredibly liberating.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was utterly transformative for me. And I remember as I was recovering those, and so I was still working, because at the time we were the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. So we were focused just on higher ed back then. And I remember looking at what I was seeing going on campus. And sometimes you'd see a case, for example, where a professor would get in trouble. We had a case that was truly absurd. It was we have tons of cases that are truly absurd. It was a student, a professor posted a picture of his daughter in a Game of Thrones T-shirt that said, "I will take what is mine with fire and blood." But it's literally like a corporate Game of Thrones HBO T-shirt. And on this campus this guy was on, this got interpreted as a threat on everyone's lives. They even likened like the fire part to being like the fire of AK-47s. And I was looking at this going like, okay, that's catastrophizing. Like that's
Correct.
That is all sorts of cognitive distortions. And what you're doing there is you're modeling them. You're basically like acting like this exaggerated sense of reality is actually true. But for most of the years that I was recovering, I was thinking about, wow, it's weird that it seems like the adults in many cases are modeling sort of exaggerated ways of thinking as if they're healthy ways to think. But thank goodness the young people aren't buying this stuff. And that really shifted, and very dramatically and very noticeably, on campus at least, around 2014.
Well, what I love about that observation is that you're using an experience from therapy, evidence-based practices from psychology, from clinical psychology, and you're helping to deeper understand a social problem from the individual perspective. And it's not just that it's one person that's catastrophizing or maybe engaged in a cognitive distortion. It's you actually noticing, oh, a lot of people are doing this. My first experience of you actually and your organization was the Atlantic article, The Coddling of the American Mind, which remind me that predated the book, correct? Because that turned into the book?
Yeah, that came out. So we started working on it, and this was a freaky thing to realize, Joe. We started working on that article 10 years ago, almost like this month, maybe 10 years ago in May, because I remember coming up in the spring to talk to Haidt about this weird idea I had about, one, the strangeness on campus had just begun, but it was quite pronounced. And I would write a short book called Freedom from Speech about that later that year. Very short book, like 10,000 words. And I told him about the idea of, the way students were sort of justifying the deplatforming that they are now advocating for and the new speech codes that they're advocating for, which was very strange because what people don't remember is that prior to 2013, say, students were really good on free speech. They were really good on the free speech rights of comedians and artists and professors and their colleagues, even if they didn't agree with them. They tended to be the best constituency for free speech on campus. But then right around the end of 2013, 2014, students were showing up and they were saying, this person needs to be deplatformed or we need this new speech code, not because I think this person is repugnant, but because I think they'll be psychologically harmful to other people, almost never them, on campus, and they'll be permanently traumatized by them. So I told John, like, this made it sound like this concern I'd had for a long time was coming true. That essentially what we were going to see was something that was at one time, in one way, a threat to academic freedom and free speech, but it was grounded in a way of thinking that models kind of cognitive distortions. So what I think we're going to see is a decrease in academic freedom and free speech on campus and an increase in mental health issues, including mood disorders like anxiety and depression.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the trends of mental health, let's just think about mental health or rates of mental illness on college campuses. That has just proven true every single year since that article initially came out.
And Joe, so much worse than we thought. Kind of like because like when we first did the original article, John, is a great researcher, so he was saying that the data wasn't there yet, but the data, of course, is lagging. What I was basing, my impression of this was hearing reports from mental health centers on campus who were reporting, all over the country that they were suddenly overwhelmed by the new crop of students who were showing up. So, not data, but definitely, convincing evidence that maybe something had changed from a lot of reputable people. And so when we came out with the original article, which came out in August, I think like August 6th or something like that of 2015, we kind of expected that maybe there'd be a little downturn, maybe like a 3%, 5% downturn in mental health or upturn in mood disorders, however you want to put it. And boy, it was so much worse. And it was also worse for academic freedom and free speech than we expected it to be as we, put a lot of the data there in Canceling of the American Mind, my more recent book.
Yeah. Well, I want to double click on, you brought up trauma earlier, and something that I've been thinking deeply about. I'd love to throw this idea at you, and I'd love to know, because you track this world and this phenomenon so much more closely than I do. I'd love to know what you think. Because when that article came out in 2015, I was still an undergrad. I went to Wesleyan University, and for any alumni or Wesleyan representatives listening, I still very much valued the education, but this phenomenon that we're referring to, which, people must be canceled, things must be censored, and this idea cannot be entertained because it is psychologically harmful, was very much present. It was very much ubiquitous. And I've spent some time thinking about that. And when I got really deep into my clinical training, I went to Northwestern for graduate school. When I got deep into my clinical training and started learning about the dynamics of trauma on the body, on the nervous system, on the mind, I started to put a few things together. So let's take an example that's very straightforward. Let's say somebody gets into a car accident. It's very, very normal for one of the symptoms following a car accident to be avoidance. Avoidance of getting into the car in extreme cases, maybe even thinking about cars or being around cars. And what the nervous system is trying to do, what the mind is trying to do, it's trying to make sense of this unimaginable thing that happened. I used to ride in cars every day, and then I couldn't conceive of it, but this horrible accident happened, and now I have PTSD or something on the trauma spectrum. It doesn't have to be formal diagnostic PTSD. And so what the mind does, in the mind's defense, if you never get into a car again, well, you're never going to be hurt like that again. You actually have some control over that horrible thing that happened to you. And left unchecked, I once had a patient who had developed, by the time they came to see me, full-blown agoraphobia. They weren't leaving their house. And in your mind's defense, in your nervous system's defense, if you never leave your house and that bad, horrible thing that happened to you, it gives you a sense of control. It gives you a sense of safety. But these ways of coping with the bad thing that happened to you is not what we would call adaptive. It doesn't necessarily bring you greater agency, better mental health. It certainly doesn't necessarily lend to social harmony, because you're probably going to get into conflicts with others. I don't want to get in the car, but you need to get in the car, et cetera. And so what you do, regardless of the modality of trauma therapy, whether it's EMDR or cognitive processing therapy, which is derived from CPT, you actually slowly and with sophistication as a practitioner, you expose them, over time to get back in the car, and you help them regulate their nervous system. And when you work with someone like that, you might say something like, well, isn't it possible you could have, fractured your shoulder in another way that wasn't a car accident? Isn't it possible that the building could have collapsed, or you could have fallen down the stairs? And when you work with someone with PTSD, they really don't like hearing that. I mean, that's a really dysregulating belief to entertain, because it calls into question the control they had.
Yeah.
Another example where this comes up a lot is if you're working with a survivor of sexual assault, they might develop the belief, and it's an incorrect belief, but they might develop this cognitive distortion, like we're talking about, where, well, that sexual assault happened to me because I was wearing a skirt that was too short. And what you have to do, and you for anyone listening, therapy, this isn't like the first intervention or question, but over time you build up to this question of, but isn't it possible that could have happened to you if you were wearing jeans? And they really don't want to entertain that, again, like I said, because there's this control. So that's one that's very oversimplified, but a dynamic of trauma. And so I've been thinking about that in terms of kind of the culture wars and free speech and college campuses, and just a lot of what we see just in today's general culture around this phenomenon of, these ideas are dangerous, and not only should they be shouted down, but they shouldn't even been spoken. I've been thinking about that in terms of identity politics, because it always struck me as odd that a lot of the people that maybe quote unquote support cancel culture, or whatever term you want to give it, it's often rooted in identity. Not always, but often. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, okay, so let's say I'll just speak for myself. So I'm a gay man. I'm part of the queer community, technically. And let's say I have a traumatizing experience, or a bunch of little experiences over my life that make me feel unsafe. And let's say I'm warranted in that. Well, in my nervous system's defense isn't a belief like all Republicans and conservatives are bad, or all straight people should be met with suspicion. Isn't that, if I only surround myself with my community, and I only surround myself with beliefs that, in theory, support me, in my nervous system's defense, is that not dissimilar from someone never getting into a car again? And left unchecked, trauma symptoms, if you're not practicing, because I love how you said that cognitive behavioral therapy, it's a practice. If you're not doing those mental gymnastics dynamics over time, I've often wondered, could that partially explain how some people are so resistant to the idea that free speech is, it's a value that should be upheld, or that it's actually not dangerous for your mental health. It's actually better for your mental health to develop resiliency and be able to navigate a world of plurality where not everyone is necessarily going to be safe or agree with you or share the same values as you. And tell me if you have any questions on that. But because it's very theoretical, but for me, it's given me a lot of compassion and grace for people who I don't necessarily agree with, who are canceling people all the time, or even people in my comment sections who, I allude to a certain thinker that they don't like. This just happened yesterday. I mentioned something about Thomas Sowell, and people were, really went after it. And I go, well, the idea I'm referring to with Thomas Sowell is that intellect and intelligence are different. Are you disagreeing with that? No, they didn't even touch the idea. It was just
Yeah.
there was this person that they were making this association with. And so I'm wondering if you make sense of all of that or how you make sense of it.
Well, I apologize that this actually got me kind of thinking about the role of free speech in therapy itself.
Oh yeah, go wherever
And
you want to go with it. Oh.
yeah, and I because I think a lot about something that, and I started going down the path of like, how would you have therapy in an environment in which people are afraid to be honest about what they really think? And can I swear on this podcast?
Yes, you can.
Okay, especially the fucked up stuff, because like how much of talking to your therapist, and I've been through a lot of therapy myself. Like how much of it is exploring some aspects of yourself that you find disturbing or troubling, and I think about kind of like the value of authenticity, and I think that when people talk about freedom of speech, they really have to stress, like in a situation in which people are empowered to punish you for your opinions or preferences or beliefs, they're telling you not to be authentic. It's unavoidable. Those are the same thing. And, and I think about the most analogous situation to the one we see today, and it's going to sound like it's an insult, but I don't mean it exactly. I don't mean it exactly like an insult. There's something. So I have surely some fierce criticism. Is that when you look at the mass censorship movements in American history, for example, generally they're connected to moments where there's a national security threat, and in some cases that national security threat is scary as all get out. And I always try to actually put myself in the like, would I have panicked under these circumstances too, and would anybody else have? So like alien sedition, like the 1798 act passed by the Congress under John Adams, second president of the United States, and people talk, and it was very explicitly a ban on criticizing the president of the United States, not the vice president, who was Thomas Jefferson, because they were different parties, or Congress. But the rationale was that they thought they were keeping us out of war with France. Now, would this keep us out of war with France? No. Was it violate the First Amendment if it was enforced by then? Absolutely, violate the First Amendment. But were the founders freaked out that this new republic might be killed in the because a war at France at that point, who knows what would have actually happened? So what I'm getting at here is that most moments in mass censorship, there was something that had the public scared, and it was usually some external threat, something genuinely scary. I think the best analogy to what's going on today is much more like the Victorian era, where it's not really about an existential threat. It's not about someone or even just a bloody threat. It's about something more of a moral threat. It's about an idea that people can be contaminated by certain ideas. People can be contaminated by certain images, for that matter. And of course, there's no historical analogy is anywhere near perfect. But I do think that since we're not actually in a situation of the kind of threat that when we believed that Americans and British spies were helping Stalin get the bomb, that the situation that we have today is more along this moral threat kind of line. And when you have those circumstances, people do self-censor. They aren't as authentic. They do actually, and they have every reason to be. One of the amazing things about the Victorian era censorship in the United States, there was a case right around the turn of the century where, and there are many like it, where people were, I think, even going to jail in some cases. In one case, because someone used the word "fuck" in a private letter to one of their friends. It really had and that starts to look like not just policing speech, that starts to look like policing thought. So in an environment in which you can be reported for wrongthink, it leads to pathological low levels of authenticity, which makes the therapeutic process incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I want to highlight this word authenticity. Because for anyone listening, anyone who is skeptical that maybe free speech or the ideal of free speech is somehow bad for mental health, or it's too oversimplistic to say that it's good for mental health, authenticity, this is a very existential idea, this idea that, well, if you can be authentic in whatever you're feeling or thinking, that there's an alignment that happens with your nervous system, and that actually provides healing from a therapeutic standpoint. It's a difficult thing to argue. It also makes me think of this idea, from Rogerian therapy, this idea of congruency. So Carl Rogers thought that a lot of what was happening mentally and emotionally with people, with his patients that he was seeing, was that the worth they were getting from the outside did not match the inside. It was incongruent. And so the way you work with someone like that in therapy is you actually give them unconditional positive regard for anything they think, anything they believe, anything that they're feeling. And over time, they kind of unknot themselves, and they're able to experience congruency. And then that's where you see symptom relief. And it's interesting to consider the cultural implications of a time where people are being inauthentic. They're maybe espousing values they don't really believe, or just saying talking points, but also from that perspective of congruency, like how that over time reinforces this idea of there's a conditional positive regard. You are only acceptable if you think a certain way, right, or if you believe a certain way. And to your point, this is more of a moral question than it is whether or not there's actual physical danger or something happening.
So Timur Karan, I'm very proud to say, is now actually on our advisory council, and he's the father of the term preference falsification, which is basically a way of just saying that people will fake what they believe in order to be more acceptable, and they'll lie about what they believe. But of course, we all know that if you lie to a certain degree, you can start persuading yourself that maybe you weren't really lying. And I think that this idea of having a dissonance in an environment where, like if you believe that take it back to the Victorian era, that only people with a disorder are attracted to people of the same sex, for example. And you have an environment where it's just too dangerous for people to be able to say on surveys that they actually are attracted to the same sex. You end up in a situation in which everything's sort of conforming to something that validates that model because people are too scared to say anything that would contradict it.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. It makes me think of some of the polls that were coming out, I mean, gosh, even 5 years ago, that was showing that, as soon as Gen Z and younger millennials get older, everything is going to go blue, everything is going to go liberal, everything is going to go progressive. And now there's all these polls coming out that's actually showing that these different generations are really ideologically split just as much as generations before. And so I wonder if that was because when you're younger, you want to fit in. You want to say like the right thing, like feel really good. And I'm not knocking anyone for doing that. I've certainly done that, in my life. But this idea of preference falsification makes me wonder about some of those kind of more projective polls about how people's beliefs are changing over time.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, I do want to talk about your new book, but before we do, I want to highlight for everyone, in this article and in the book, The Coddling of the American Mind, just to kind of recap the timeline, you were saying, you identified that a lot of the ways of thinking in public discourse actually mirrored the cognitive distortions that are associated with a lot of mental pathology.
Yep.
And so your hypothesis, I don't know if that's quite the right way to put it, but your hypothesis at the time was, well, free speech is actually more aligned with the evidence-based practices of mental health. Mm-hmm. And because there's a misalignment between what we know about mental health culturally, because there's a misalignment of what we know about how mental health works individually, and we're seeing it reflected culturally, we're going to have a mental health crisis. And we're certainly in a mental health crisis. Can you tell me a little bit about?
I would say I would disagrre with that a little bit.
Okay.
Tell me. Yeah. I was actually saying that two different phenomena were going to be caused by the same thing, and those are that a distorted way of looking at the world that catastrophizes, engaged in all this exaggerated kind of idea of threat present simply by having someone with an opposing opinion on campus, even if it's a horrifying opinion. Was going to be a threat to academic freedom and free speech, but also making the connection that same common variable will also be a disaster for free speech, or you can also trace it backwards to say having that thought means that also be a disaster for mental health. You can trace it potentially backwards as well, but basically kind of like these two phenomena arise out of this distorted way of thinking. Not necessarily that free speech is essential to this entire idea. But I do think that we did raise younger people to think that you're more easily harmed by words and for that matter, opinions, than the research indicates we are. And that's something that I talk a lot about the idea of lying to people. There's something kind of cruel about lying to young people about resilience, about the fact that the normal response to challenging circumstances is not trauma. It's actually resilience.
That's correct.
And framing it in the opposite way, I think that there's something. Here's what bugs me the most about this, Joe, and I didn't emphasize this as much in Coddling, but the more I've been exposed to it, the more it does actually, I'll say flat out, it angers me, is that I feel like some of this came from a mindset that essentially if we make you feel in threat, if we make you feel guilty, if we make you feel shameful, if we make you feel like doomed, this will somehow this will lead you to pursue what we deem to be socially beneficial causes as you get older. Mm-hmm. And I think this is also bad social science and bad psychology, because when you give people thoughts that are, hopeless, they don't become good activists. And when it comes to anxious people, what they often think the solution is often way out of line of what actually fixes circumstance. Partially because they're not thinking all that clearly, because they're thinking with a frightened mind. But also hopelessness never made someone want to change the world in a positive way, at least. And so I think that some of this came from a faulty assumption that some of these very strong negative feelings would somehow motivate them towards positive social action was first flawed from the very get-go, but second, cruel.
Yeah, it is. It's something I talk about all the time. To your second point there, I'll get on my platform and I'll have conversations or I'll make content and I'll say things like, did you know that the vast majority of people who get into a car accident do not develop trauma symptoms? Or did you know that most soldiers that see combat, don't actually meet the full criteria? Resiliency is the default. And I've often found that's cruel too, because as you know, through all your experience with cognitive therapy, the story you tell yourself, it's incredibly powerful. And we also know that an internal locus of control, I bring this up all the time. If you believe,
absolutely huge point. I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, if you believe that you can affect your circumstances, not to an exaggerated extreme,
right,
within the realm of reason, that's associated with positive mental health outcomes. It is pretty much established fact at this point that sort of agency is good for mental health. And it's interesting to notice that when this actually comes up, even within my own field, people immediately deliver that a lot of criticism. And I'm always a little bit suspicious at how well those practitioners are helping their patients one-on-one. It makes me wonder. And your point about the timeline and the phenomenon being intertwined but separate is well taken. Let's talk a little bit about your new book. So tell me a little bit about between coddling and canceling. Why write this? What were you seeing?
Yeah. So Canceling of the American Mind, which came out in October 17th, not exactly the best time a book to come out because it was overshadowed by events in the Middle East, which then people started to put together were not entirely divorced from each other, at least in the way we handled some of this on college campuses. They actually turned out to be pretty closely, but it took people a while to get the connection. And I was originally, after Coddling came out, I was contacted by this young, brilliant journalist named Rikki Schlott. She contacted me, I think, way back in 2020 when she was still, 19 or something like that. She dropped out of NYU because she didn't want to, pay the absurd price of NYU to go to what she describes as Zoom school, because of COVID, she would have just been on Zoom, and it seemed to be ridiculous. And she wanted to interview me about coddling, because she said that one of the things that encouraged her to drop out of school during COVID was actually all the problems we pointed to in Coddling. And she wanted to make the argument that maybe the adversity of COVID would actually, uncoddle would actually be the kind of positive adversity that people overcome that could make them feel empowered. She always jokes that, that didn't come to pass. I'm like, I'm always a little bit like, hold your horses. There may be examples where that we just don't know about, where that very thing did happen. And I have very little doubt that for some people, they rose to the challenge and will always feel a little more empowered from it. I just don't think that's, most people. But so she was so brilliant and so talented. We decided to make her a fellow at Fire, and she now she's a columnist for the Post. She used to write for Reason magazine. And after a year of working with her, we started talking about the idea of what, it would be really cool to do a follow-up to Coddling of the American Mind that would be co-authored with a Gen Z youngster, because so much of Coddling is about problems faced in particular by Gen Z young women. So co-authoring something with someone that, as brilliant as she is, but also has firsthand experience of these things just seemed like it could be a really powerful follow-up to Coddling. But when we started talking more about doing the book together, I really started to get annoyed by seeing that there were still people out there, and they actually seemed to be getting a little bit bolder, saying that, this cancel culture thing that even the New York Times called out is a myth, or a hoax, or it never happened. And it's kind of funny to see people who both used to say it never happened also then saying it was over. It's like, okay, you got to pick one of those. And so we decided to do a book just laying out how much data and information there was that shows that not only did this happen, particularly when it comes to the number of professors who lost their jobs, this is happening on a unprecedented historical scale, at least certainly since the law was established around 1973, but even going back further. And we're the only ones who really had that data at Fire. So I felt like it was up to us. And we set out to do three things in the book. One, just prove cancel culture happened. And we make the point. It's also cancel culture when the right does it, and we call them out as well. And I take that for granted. Of course it is. Part two, and this is what I think is the most interesting part of the book, we try to get people to think about cancel culture as just one way of winning arguments without winning arguments. The idea that essentially I can try to refute you, I can try to persuade you that you're wrong, or I could scare you out of ever disagreeing with me again, or I could try to take your piece off the board by getting you fired, make you no longer a journalist, no longer a professor, no longer a student, and that will teach everyone else to shut up as well. But to think of that as part of a larger, unfortunately kind of permissible way of shutting down discussion with things that don't relate to the substance of someone's arguments. Ad hominem attacks, for example, like dismissing someone on the basis of identity, is just one example of it. And I actually went through a lot of this on my Substack in a review of actually Abigail Shrier's new book, Bad Therapy, since I've seen basically every tool in the perfect rhetorical fortress, as we call it, used against her, in addition to so many other people. And then part three is to try to begin to suggest some potential remedies to these problems. Now, of course, we take some flack for the fact that we called it cancel culture, and we called it cancel culture for a very simple reason. We'd done our own polling, and we knew that black, white, liberal, or conservative, that is the term that most Americans know and understand. They're not in doubt that this happened. And that if we were to call it some other more public, more acceptable, the New Yorker has a piece, about cancel culture today where they put in scare quotes. That, I don't think I'll ever convince you that this is the correct term. But if we decided to come up with a different term to make the New Yorker happy, we wouldn't make them happy, and we'd also be leaving, most of the rest of the public wondering, what on earth we're talking about. What's this weird new term we thought we had to invent for cancel culture?
Fair enough. Absolutely. I've read through the book. It is, as you said, full of a lot of really great data. I wanted to double click on two things. One is chapter, I believe it's chapter 2. You titled it the gaslighting of the American mind. Something I'm very much known for, in case you're not aware, Greg, is I constantly am commentating on the use and misuse of different kind of pop psychology terms. And when I opened the book and I saw that chapter, I thought to myself, I go, oh no, did they co-opt this term, to make a point? But then I read the chapter, and I actually am very, very proud to tell you that you applied it to a cultural phenomenon, but you used it pretty well. I mean, gaslighting it's a form of psychological manipulation, of coercive control, where you get people to kind of start doubting the perception of their own reality. And when people come out and say, what do you mean cancel culture doesn't exist? What do you mean? What do you mean? Like, you're exaggerating. You're the one that's being too sensitive, all this stuff, despite all the data you outlay in the book. I actually think it's a very appropriate application of the term. So from a licensed professional to you, you have my full approval.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen the movie Gaslight.
Yeah, totally.
I also saw the most boring BBC update and adaptation of this Gaslight of Gaslight. One time when I was over there, my mom's British, and it was like 3 hours of like the most boring version of the movie Gaslight. But and actually, I've seen people misuse the term gaslighting. But I find it as difficult to convey. Do you know the movie Anchorman? Mm-hmm. One thing that Will Ferrell does in that movie that I think is absolutely brilliant is he constantly misuses the term "when in Rome" and times when it does not apply. Right. And it's really hard to get your brain to use it wrong. So how do people misuse it? Because I've seen it, but I can't remember exactly how it worked. Yeah. But what were they using it? How are they misusing it?
So something I'm very much, focused on in my work, particularly my media work, is basically if you look at how mental health has gone from destigmatized to popularized in a very short time, the dust is still settling in a lot of ways. And one of the things that's happening is these terms are getting put out on social media, and a 60-second Instagram reel isn't necessarily the best place to convey a lot of nuance in a definition. And so part of it is just fair. A game of telephone. So maybe the first person that, talks about gaslighting in a YouTube video uses it, and then these different relationships coach starts to use it, and then these narcissistic abuse survivors start to use it, and then overall, if you see all these, even if a sizable minority of the videos are misusing it just in the lack of nuance, then there's going to be a lot of confusion, and then confusion begets more confusion, etc. The other thing that I believe is happening is that I'm a strong believer in just because somebody knows psychological or therapeutic jargon does not make them emotionally intelligent, and it doesn't make them emotionally evolved. Yeah. And if you are what we would call a vulnerable narcissist, so that the type of narcissistic personality that plays victim a lot, telling someone that they're gaslighting you and they're invalidating you and they don't care about your feelings, et cetera, is actually a very effective strategy to poke on someone's guilt and shame. Yeah. And so gaslighting is not disagreeing. It's also I really like the way Dr. Ramani puts it. She makes a lot of content about narcissism and emotional abuse, but she says, gaslighting is a grooming process. It kind of happens over time. And I thought you did that actually quite well in the chapter, because it wasn't just about this example with this paper. It was about how this is a broader conversation that reinforces this idea that this isn't happening, even though it clearly is.
So grooming, so in the sense of sort of training someone to see if they can be trusted to disbelieve their own eyes if you say so?
Correct. So in an emotionally abusive dynamic, it is not often the case that the abuser comes out with really, let's say, cruel insults and personal insults right away. The first phase of those relationships are often quite nice. They're actually even euphoric. Yeah. But it's only over time that you become emotionally invested that they then you kind of see in hindsight. It's very common for survivors to then see how there are all these little things they start. You've seen the film Gaslighting, how it starts oh, I didn't tell you that. Even though it's not actually a big deal, because they're kind of testing to see how far they can push you. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I want to talk, as we get towards the end here, you also had a chapter about psychotherapy. And I have to say, I felt incredibly seen by this chapter as someone that has been to grad school.
I appreciate that so much, because it was the most depressing chapter to write.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to give you my riff on it, but you
Please.
tell me why include it? Because it surprised me. I wasn't expecting it in the book.
Well, it's partially because, particularly since I wrote the original Coddling article, I've been much more plugged into psychological circles and practicing psychotherapists and psychologists and psychiatrists even. And it started getting back to me a lot more often from people both in graduate programs and in PhD programs and in private practice that some of their colleagues were talking about, intervening in actual therapy sessions to correct incorrect beliefs, to sort of educate their patients on their appropriate political beliefs, which I just thought was absolutely mind-boggling. And the other thing that I'd heard was a lot of hand-wringing in some of these programs about what if, God forbid, I should end up being someone who treats a Republican. I find out that I've been treating this person. It turns out they're, God forbid, a Trump supporter. And of course, I'm like, okay, this is freaking me out because it's like, I would think that your answer would be, as a compassionate human being and who cares about people's mental well-being, that you would, have that you'd have compassion for them, and that you would treat them like any other patient and check your own biases at the door. And the more I heard those kind of stories, the more, and here's the thing, Joe, that was a chapter that I was like, okay, I know I have to stop writing it here. Me and Ricky have to stop writing it here. But that could easily be its own book because it's such a distressing turn, and I hope it's not an overarching trend. But honestly, you would know better than me. What's your experience has been with that?
So my experience, I thought about grad school, and I know for a fact that in grad school there was this phenomenon of people saying certain talking points that they knew would be received well by the class, but that they also knew would get a higher grade. There's a lot of self-reflection in shrink school, which is a good thing. Let me be clear.
Sure.
I entered grad school having been through a lot of therapy, but for people who hadn't, I think it's really, really important to kind of bring at least, there's kind of a lowest common denominator of self-reflection amongst the classmates. And I know that in some of my classes, I got to a point where I was just getting really sick and tired of some of the same kind of woke social justice talking points. We had some conservative classmates, and even they would parrot them. And I would say, well, I know you're socially conservative and you're a pastor, for crying out loud. I know you don't believe what you just said. And I would actually like to get into it with you, from a purely academic perspective, but there really wasn't that permission. And I think one of the more, and overall, I kind of, like I said with Wesleyan, I really did enjoy Northwestern's program. But if I'm being honest, I did have instructors who would give me higher grades if I self-reflected that I'm a self-hating gay man than actually just being honest about, wherever I was at. And I just thought it was absolutely despicable. And I know I wasn't the only one that experienced that, because I would actually reach out to the other minorities in the class, because, you would know, we get to know each other pretty well. And they were saying, look, I'm seeing the same thing, but I don't want to rock the boat. I just want to get an A and I want to get out. And I left that program maybe with a sense of, if I ever go back to grad school or in just conversations in my adult life, I'm not going to censor myself like that anymore. It's not aligned with the literature, as we've talked about in today's conversation. And I think that in terms of people not able to counsel someone of a different political belief than you, I question your competency as a practitioner. Yeah. And I know that might come across harsh, but I really, really do, because even though the American Counseling Association has all these, kind of multicultural, principles that, people are supposed to espouse. And that's why I'm so glad you wrote it in the book. It gives me permission to speak out against this topic, because on one hand, you have these ethical codes of respecting agency and not causing harm. But then on the other hand, you have these other codes saying, but you have to encourage certain types of conversations and thinking about things in a certain way. And that's actually just, you can't believe both of those things.
Yeah.
if anyone at the ACA is listening to this, it's like you have to pick one or the others from a purely logical perspective. And so it's, for me, I mean, I'm thinking about, Israel and Palestine and everything that's happening right now. I have in my caseload right now people on both sides of that equation. And I am able to, regardless of my own personal beliefs on the matter, I'm getting support from my colleagues through supervision if I need it. And I'm able to help them with their mental health goals and actually using current events as a way to do that. So I'll just give you an example. Someone who's very pro-Palestine that I'm working with feels powerless. And we ended up having a really great conversation about how she can be more conscious in the kinds of products that she purchases and services that she purchases. Wonderful. It helps her feel like she's moving towards something.
Right.
And then there's, people many of them are Jewish, although not all of them are on the more kind of pro-Israel side. Like they're also getting involved and they're living an authentic, congruent life. And that is actually good for their mental health. My opinion shouldn't actually matter. And let me just throw this out there for you because I track social media on the internet all the time. I've seen comment sections and videos where people have actually gone as far to say is, my psychiatrist didn't put me on medication because they assess that, my anxiety symptoms or my symptoms are a natural response to the social injustices that people of my identity are working with. And I'm sitting here and I'm saying, while I understand that argument, one could argue that a better regulated nervous system is actually a better arbiter of the values that you want to advocate for.
Yeah.
And so it all just gets very, twisted up. And in a way, maybe it's kind of nice to kind of end on this somewhat of a cliffhanger because it's a conversation I would very much like to continue. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on in the first place is I'm very interested in better understanding this relationship between free speech and mental health, and really just kind of like the culture wars and how it all kind of intertwines. It's all oddly interconnected.
Yeah, no. I obviously think a lot about that, and the goal ultimately is getting people to live in the world as it is, right. with as you say, congruence and with hopefully with some amount of joy and meaning in their lives, and that's very hard to achieve because when you're in the position of the censor, you're taking on a omniscient kind of mindset, and it basically means knowing outcomes with a level of precision that's simply impossible. And I think that if the goal is to actually live in the world as it is, first we have to know what the world is, and there's literally no way to do that without knowing what people really think. That's a key part of the nature of reality. And so it will always mean that free speech is of extreme importance, particularly for us, even just a purely scientific understanding of the world.
Absolutely. For me, one thing I wanted to bring up with you but that we didn't get to is this topic of trigger warnings.
Yeah.
And as I'm sure you have tracked, there's actually been some data that has come out in the last year showing that they're not as effective as we hoped. And I've talked to colleagues who are also teachers. Students really don't like hearing that. And I've also found that when I have posted about this on my platform, people really don't like hearing that.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to, I just kind of wanted to get your, the more kind of your updated perspective on trigger warnings, but B, I wanted to share a theory with you because what I found in my comment sections, it was fascinating, is some people were saying, I'm actually in treatment. I've been diagnosed with PTSD. And if there's something about, let's say rape, or there's something, truly triggering the material, it'll actually, it'll start it can trigger a dissociative episode, and like I need to go back into therapy, and it actually like really messes up my day. And I have a lot of sympathy for that as someone that has treated a lot of trauma. But my takeaway from that conversation is not so much that, well, then we need to implement trigger warnings. It's actually that I think a lot of the implementation of trigger warnings is not actually about a clinically significant trigger, is my suspicion. It's actually about feeling emotionally activated and uncomfortable. We talked about gaslighting earlier. People misuse the word trigger all the time to mean I feel an unpleasant thing.
Right.
And so I guess, that's just kind of where I've been at with it.
Yeah, no, I think there are now 8 studies. Not a single one of them. I think there might even be more. Not a single one of them show any benefit. No. Some of them, like Richard McNally's studies, show that it makes people have a to believe words can be leaves them believing words can be more harmful than a control group believed. And so like there's no research, and the research that hasn't been done directly is that but it's really clear when you ask student opinion, professor opinion overall, is that professors are freaked out to talk about difficult topics now, and that comes out through different surveys. So it does seem like it's held on to as something that just it feels intuitively like a nice, compassionate thing, but you still got to you got to trust the science. It's like it isn't showing itself to be, and some of the evidence actually indicates that it can be actually reinforcing some other negative outcomes, and definitely if it's making professors scared to cover difficult topics, for example, like rape law. You got to think through what the ramifications are of that. And I always make the point that kind of like the consequence of not more lawyers knowing about the contours of law relating to rape is going to work out to the detriment of victims of rape.
Right. Absolutely. Well, let me share a little anecdote about something I really appreciated about my education, because I actually think at least my opinion on the educational solution to this problem, I think it's both and. I think that so in shrink school, you often talk about a lot of personal things, and sometimes those things would trigger the students in the classroom. But because we were all getting trained in what we were trained in, it's an unbelievably supportive environment. I mean, people were, we would take time to self-regulate and do breathing exercises in class, et cetera. Now, the downside of that was my graduate school experience didn't necessarily have the kind of sharpening of swords, like the debate, that I imagine a law school is, like lends itself really well to. But I think that, I do think that regardless of if it's law school or if it's, clinical psychology training or whatever it is, I feel like there might actually be room for both. Let's actually teach the class and, if you're feeling emotionally activated, I think if it's a clinical trigger, you need to outsource that to a trained professional. But if you're feeling emotionally activated, can we actually normalize what we know about emotional regulation and dysregulation and actually help get us, help us regulate and then kind of go back into like logic brain and actually proceed. Maybe that's ideal and naive of me to think, but I don't think it's asking a whole lot. I really don't. So
I like I appreciate your hope, and I think that's a great note to end on.
All right. Well, as we wrap up, how can people keep up with you and your organization? How can people find the book? How can we find you?
Easiest way to find me are two ways. Thefire.org is my organization, and we're much bigger than we used to be. There's about 120 employees now, and my Substack is called The Eternally Radical Idea, which is a reference to freedom of speech. I do more on the intersection between psychology and free speech on Eternally Radical Idea. But as far as free speech and the deeper philosophy behind it, like the whole FIRE team, is gung-ho about helping people understand that better, because I feel like that one of the things that is missing from the discussion is how deep the philosophy is, and how great some of the thinkers, have been in explaining the critical role of free speech and everything from scientific to artistic progress, and of course, to democracy itself.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much again for coming on. We'll have to have you back next season. And for those of you who are still listening, if you've been enjoying Therapy versus the World, please remember you can listen to these episodes early and ad-free only on Luminary.